Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Art Like Everything Else, the podcast. I'm Mo, your host, and this week we're going to be using art to talk about harm and kind of like what it looks like, what it might be, and even some ways to kind of mitigate or circumvent it. So, with that being said, let's get right into it. So, for our first work of art, we're going to be talking about a short film. Now, I won't be spoiling the short film too much. It is a beautiful depiction of the kind of the content of it. It's animated. It's about 6 minutes, and the short film is called Overcomer. Now, this short film is by um, a person named Hannah Grace. It's on YouTube, and I'm going to be sure to link it in the description below. Now, because this short film, again, is short, it's less than 6 minutes, I highly recommend you go watch it and then come back. But honestly, if you do not go watch it, do be sure to watch it, even if it's just after this. I'm gonna talk about it briefly, like very briefly, because again, it's a short film. Like I can't go into detail without like spoiling essentially what might be the entire thing. But for a bit of a gist of it, this short film sort of follows this girl kind of realizing that she's like a lot of the harm she kind of experienced started with bullying kind of growing up. And it's kind of her watching what that looked like and how that kind of affected her. And it's a really good short film. I highly recommend you watch it. I'm also just a really big fan of animation, and it's animated. So, yeah. But yeah, definitely watch it. And the reason this particular film is going to be sort of related to the topic at hand today is because harm looks a plethora of ways. And the verbal things you can hear verbally are just one of those. And you can kind of see this verbal harm impacting the main character of this short film in a very big way. And so, with that being said, I also want to touch on some pretty cool, well, not cool, harm is not cool, some other aspects of harm in our next work of art. Alrighty, so our next work of art is a K drama. I'm a very big fan of K dramas. If you can't tell, I think this might be like my second K drama that I'll be talking about, and I am gonna probably talk about more in the future. So get used to it. But they're just also really good modes of storytelling. And so like when with the whole purpose of my podcast kind of being talking about art or using art to talk about a bunch of different topics, sometimes those topics show up in there, and I feel like it's a really good depiction of trying to get the ball rolling on certain conversations. And so, with that being said, a K drama that I'm going to be using to discuss using to help discuss the topic at hand today is called The Double Judge. At least that's the English name. I'm pretty sure it's a direct translation of the Korean title. But without too many spoilers, because I recommend you go watch this show. It is a show, 16 episodes. It was released in 2021, and so this show follows the main character Kim Ga-eun, and he is a judge. He's a judge for in this sort of dystopic South Korean future, in which um like there's a very big disparity between the upper class and the lower class. And so what's sort of happening is um honestly there's a lot happening. But what I want to kind of focus on is there's a very big theme of sort of like, because especially because he's a judge and he works in law, um there's a very big theme of sort of like getting like kind of justice, seeking justice, especially for harm caused by folks. Especially, and we can kind of see how harm takes place in this show between not just like interpersonally, but like societally. So like we see harm sort of show up in a multitude of ways, and it's kind of in those ways that I want to talk about in our conversation at hand. So, like in the show, we're following Kim Ga-eun. He's a judge on a live court case show that we see being kind of directed and broadcast it live for the entire country of Korea. And it's very, very interesting all the ways in which you can kind of see harm taking place, especially if you're keeping an eye out for it. Because like in this show, like without really any major spoilers, but you see it happen interpersonally. You see it happen, of course, like collectively. You see it happen on a societal level with like legislation and like actual like laws and things behind it, and like you see it even happening in the way certain things are kind of starting to poison the minds of not just the people, but even like warping how people sort of engage or witness harm. And so, sort of slight spoiler warning, but there's a very, very like impactful scene in this show where we see Kim Ga-eun witness kids sort of reenacting one of the punishments that they saw from one of the cases that was broadcasted on this live courtroom. And they're making light of it, and you can see the people who are kind of doling that punishment out to as a game, like the kids sort of doling that punishment out as a game, are kind of laughing and they're having fun, and they don't get just how severe and how terrible, like how severe and terrible what they're actually doing is, because they've kind of taken it to possibly just being kind of like a game. And like of course you see the kid who's kind of receiving that punishment not enjoying himself, but because also like you kind of see Kim Ga-eun kind of struggling with his role in letting that be the case, or being a part of why that is something he's witnessing in that moment. And I thought that was a really, really powerful scene. And I kind of want to talk about a bit more about all the different ways that harm does show up in our next section. For today's conversation, I wanted to talk about harm. And so to start this conversation off, I wanted to give a quick little definition of harm. So Collins Dictionary describes harm, or at least one of the several definitions of harm is to harm a thing or sometimes a person means to damage them or make them less effective or successful than they were. And so, what does this type of harm look like? So, this type of harm can look in a multitude of ways. So, sort of like in our short film Overcomer, we kind of see how verbal harm can affect a person, but we can see how verbally calling someone names, putting somebody down about like things they enjoy, especially, can cause them harm. Like if, like, to even elaborate, like I remember, at least especially in America, there was a phrase sort of going around that was like sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And like years later, we've come to find out just how non-true that is. Because while granted, it was supposed to be a way to sort of like circumvent bullying or try to make it seem as though words don't mean nearly as much, we've come to find out, especially with like more research into like what trauma is and what like constitutes like almost mental health, and like we've gotten a better grasp of these things, we've come to learn that like words in fact do hurt, and words can in fact have a very lasting impact. And that matters when it comes to harm, because so often people are kind of experiencing these things or on the other end of these things, and are experiencing this harm, and it's affecting them mentally, but they don't like not it's under talked about almost. But that verbal is also not the only way that you can experience harm. We already know of physical harm, and physical harm can happen in a multitude of ways as well. Just think of all the ways you could probably physically hurt someone that would constitute physical harm. There's also, I would also argue that there are ways in which society installs or instills rules and regulations and expectations that can also be harmful to an individual. We see that in our show, The Devil Judge, where the expectations for people of a certain status is actually different than those of someone in the not so good status. So like those who are poor, those who are considered disposable, often have less rights or less, like they aren't taken as seriously when it comes to being harmed, as those who are of the upper echelon. And it's prevalent all throughout the show. You see it in the ways in which the poor folks, they're experiencing harm as a result of the actions or the rulings or the laws put in place by these people in high positions. And then those same laws are then sort of circumvented and gotten around to kind of make it so that people in these higher positions, people with lots of money, do not have to experience those same consequences or do not have to experience or live with what it is that's happening. And it's sort of very obvious in that like it's not fair. And yeah, so it's like there are so many ways that harm shows up. And I even argue another form of harm is even warping the moral integrity of those around you. And so we see that happen in the Devil Judge as well, where like with the scene I sort of described previously, where we see the children making a game of one of these very, very harsh punishments that like quite literally used to be outlawed because they saw it happening through the live, like on, because as a result of the live court ruling. And it's like it's sort of, it's harmful in that it is making light of something that has been deemed and seen to be harmful and negative, and it is warping their ability to sort of understand what is harmful and what is not something to be joked about or made light of versus what is something that could potentially be okay. You see how in the show also, another thing you witness is almost like these people who become almost cult like of some of the judges on the show, and they start revering these judges almost as like they themselves are these, like they themselves is a saint and like are these harbingers of justice, at least in their eyes. And so what they don't understand or what's happening with them, and like as they also try to recruit people to see the world the way they see it, they are building up these almost these extremist groups with these extremist ideals and corrupting the moral integrity of those around them, and like what is actually right, what is actually okay, and how you go about it. um and then another another like type of harm that I think should be talked about more actually is the mental harm kind of forced upon um people. Like there are actually quite a few different instances where we see people kind of inflicting this sort of mental torture on folks. And quite frankly, and I'm gonna be honest, in the Devil Judge, you'll probably get just about every sort of witness, probably every sort of harm that can be done to a person, like financial harm, you witness like mental harm, you witness physical harm, you witness verbal harm, you witness societal harm, like communal harm, like you witness so many different versions of these harmful things that happen to people. And I feel like it definitely needs to be talked about more, because harm, we so often only think of it as like one to one essentially. But I feel like in this show, in this show especially, but at least this, I would say this show is a very good depiction of how I feel like it sort of actually would work in the real world. But like harm is not always one to one. Harm is more or less like a light in, rather than maybe like a laser. So it's more like an overhead light, and that like wherever that light touches, there is the possibility of harm sort of affecting it. So like it, you might not. So like you say someone hits you, yes, that right there was physical harm. But again, think of it on a grander scheme. So like in the For example, I'm going to use domestic violence. Now, say in a domestic dispute, sometimes you will see one aggressor, you'll see the aggressor hit the victim. And in instances like that, that victim is not only experiencing that physical harm, they're experiencing a bit of like mental harm and emotional harm, because of like what the relationship between these two people are supposed to be. And then while that's happening, there's also the likelihood of financial or like other harms that are kind of also kind of in making this victim reliant on this other person. And then think of it as maybe this is like parents or people in front of other people. So not only are the is this victim harm, but also there's a sort of reverberation of harm happening to all of those around. So like in witnessing this, the people who are witnessing this are also harmed in a way in where it's affecting either like their moral integrity or it's affecting them mentally, because it is also like sort of warping what their view of right and wrong, or forcing them to also sort of be afraid of this other person. And so harm doesn't only ever really affect one person, it reverberates from the room, almost like an echo. Um, and I think it's important that we kind of like be a bit more intentional about doing what we can to reduce harm as much as possible. And so for that, I actually did find an article online that talks about 5 different ways to circumvent harm, or to kind of avoid like it was 5 ways for ethical decision making. But I do believe this article, which I am going to have in the description, is also going to be really really good for like at least some of the rules. At least, well, for, at least for some of the takeaways in this article, I feel like they sort of also correlate with the best ways to kind of avoid harm or reduce the amount of harm within your vicinity as much as possible, like with whatever is in your power. And so I actually want to read those takeaways and kind of talk a bit briefly about those. So the very first takeaway when it comes to like avoiding harm is called understanding. So of course you want to make sure you understand why avoiding harm is important. So like why is it important to not hurt other people? Which I think should be sort of self-explanatory. And I want you to let me know why it's important not to hurt other people in the comments below. And yeah, it's very important to not hurt other people. And I'm sure lots of people have their reasons, but in general, hurting other people is wrong. And so, kind of understanding why that's wrong, why it is that this is the case, is going to be our very first step into doing what we can to avoid harm in the very first place. All right, so our second key takeaway for avoiding harm is to implement and sort of create some ways in which you can like monitor and like avoid harming other people as much as possible. So things like communicating. So like if you know being in certain environments might trigger you in a specific way, make sure that those you are with knows that, or make sure that like the relationship is in to such an extent that like communication is can feel open and honest and like forthcoming, so that like not only are you a safe space for people to come and like be open with you about things that they might consider harmful to them or be harmful in general, but that you also kind of provide that open space for others as well. Oh, but and also you also should be able to go to other people as well. That's going to be really really important to kind of create that atmosphere of open communication. You're also going to want to just be have integrity. So if you know something is wrong, if you are able to recognize something is wrong, you do need to kind of have that integrity and step up, speak up about it, so that people also know that you are very adamant about sort of fostering that community of like avoiding harm at all costs. Like you want to be sort of seen as like that safe space. And that's going to be really, really important. Our next step to sort of or avoid harm as much as possible is I want you to be transparent. So I want you to make sure that those you are going to be in community with and those you wish to be in community with, kind of like with the last step where we were talking about that open communication, I think it is also very, very important that we are transparent in making so that like we can make sure we are kind of cultivating that safe space. So like try don't force people, like also like make sure people are kind of like have this sense of informed consent. Don't like make sure they people have all the facts when it comes to like their engagement with you, and you want to make try to make sure you're in community with people who are open and honest and transparent to give you all the facts so that way you know all that you are engaging with. And I think that's very, very important. Our very next step, so this is, we're now on the fourth key takeaway. So our fourth takeaway for avoiding harm is actually going to be sort of developing cultural competence. So how things look in one person's culture or one person's community is likely going to be different in another person's community. And it's going to be very, very important that you try to understand that, or you try to do what you can to make sure that that is respected. It is okay if something might make you uncomfortable, but also be open to understanding why things might look different culturally. Like that's something I know I have to do, even when watching like K dramas and things. I have to understand that like there are certain behaviors, there are certain expectations happening in these shows where I might be like, why would you even let that happen? Um, I also have to kind of come to terms with the fact that it's like, oh, we are from two completely different cultures. How I might have been raised to behave in certain situations, you likely were not. Like it is like not. It's culturally incongruent with what you were raised to do in that in maybe like that home culture. And so it's very important that you understand that like people are raised differently, people act differently, people have come to have different ideas of what is normal, and so it is important that you do what you can to be culturally competent and just like sort of be try to be aware so that you that can honestly help with what is going to be our very fifth key takeaway, which we've kind of been hinting at all along, is being that safe space for other people. So fostering this culture of ethical responsibility around yourself to do what you can to avoid harm in the first place. So you want to be that safe space for people. And to be that safe space, you're going to want to do all of these things because all of these things are kind of going to be very, very important and would work hand in hand in making it possible for you to be that safe space. So, yeah, I think avoiding harm is going to be something we have to actively work towards because even now, like, there are things I'm learning about even now that like I didn't know before that could be seen as harmful. And because I know I want to be considered a safe space, I do what I can to learn and to course correct. As I know more, I learn more and I do better. And so like it's not like that's I say all this to say that it is not going to be like a complete 180 immediately, most likely. Like you're learning and there are things that you're having to learn on the spot most likely, and that is okay to have to learn things on the spot. I think it is important to remember that we are human and to understand that just because you are wrong, it doesn't mean you are unforgivable. However, that does not necessarily like grant you access to everyone on purpose. So, yes, maybe avoiding harm and avoiding causing harm to others too can be an art. An art like everything else. Last but certainly not least is this week's awe moment. So for this week's awe moment, our art that made me think this week, especially when it came to this specific topic, is Avatar: The Last Airbender, and it's the very first season. So the one with Aang, well not the very first section. So the one with Aang, not the later ones, I guess. I say that I'm laughing because like I haven't seen the ones without Aang yet. They're on my list. But I really excited about this newest one, so now I do kind of feel like I need to hurry up and watch all of Legend of Korra to catch up with this one, and so I can watch this latest rendition of it. But the reason I was kind of thinking about this sort of like harm and like what it looks like, because if I'm honest with you, the original topic for this episode was going to be redemption. Um, and so like when I think of redemption arcs and like solid ones at least, I do think um like Uncle Iroh might be a fairly good one. And I think Zuko also has a pretty cool redemption arc. But as I kind of thought about it, like and like fleshed out the episode a bit more, I wanted to talk about just the avoidance of harm in general. Because I think redemption, which is sort of a topic I've kind of had in the past, I think on a previous episode. So I'm gonna link that in the comments below as well if you'd like to check it out. That episode, it's from last season. But about like I think it's about like who's allowed to be redeemed, and I kind of realized that like redemption is somewhat debatable, and so maybe that's a topic I'll have when I have a guest on. But yes, what I was saying, as I fleshed out the episode and I kind of pivoted towards it being just about avoiding harm in general, I kind of realized that like I think Avatar: The Last Airbender still kind of fit, because something I talked about this previously, but how like this moral integrity was like warped um by the harm being caused and inflicted on other communities and whatnot happening, like how we see it in the Devil Judge that we talked about previously with that scene with the children. We also kind of saw it happening with the Fire Nation, and even so like with the Fire Nation we see how like when Aang in one of the seasons he was like when he pretended to be someone of the Fire Nation to sort of hide for a little while. We see him interacting with the other children there. We see him interacting and having fun, and like how what they're learning and even learning in their classrooms is so counter to what's actually happening outside. And so it's not even kind of discussing or showing the harm that's actually happening outside of the Fire Nation. It's like they're receiving filtered information. And we see that because of that filtered information, how they engage and how they think of these other people, and sort of like it affects how they treat them. And like that's sort of what we're seeing. We see that happen in the Devil Judge. We see that happen even now. But that's often sort of like the start of a lot of the harm being caused. Is like there's this level of ignorance to the people you are harming, and because of that ignorance you think it is okay to hurt them, and it is not okay to hurt them. It's not okay to hurt anybody for no reason. And so I think it's really really important to just like thinking about this show and thinking about this week's topic. I think it's important that like we also keep that in mind. And so that's why like one of the things I personally try to live by is I don't assume malice where it might just be ignorance. So I try not to assume that the person is just being willfully harmful, at least not at first. It's only after if they continue to do it, even after being corrected, then I'm like, oh, you're trying to be harmful. Um, but yeah, it's like, it's generally like this art, it really made me think, because like how harm itself also like just doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like what harm is seen as acceptable and what harm isn't seen as or deemed as acceptable, like it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like there's a reason why I feel like there's been such a focus on physical violence being harmful and being considered terrible, whereas like so much of the violence that is often inflicted on people everywhere is verbal. Like, there's so much to be said about like why certain things are deemed okay and why other things are deemed not okay, and it all has to do with like how you were raised, society, like, and how you were told to behave, and like those things have a very, very big influence on us. And I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind as we're walking and engaging and living our lives. But yeah, that's actually all I have for you today. If you like what you watch, let me know in the comments, drop a like, and be sure to subscribe and download this episode if you can. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being. And be sure to also follow the channel and follow me on social media, and you'll get updates on the next episode and when all these other cool projects that I promise are coming are going to be released. Yes. Also, yeah. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.